Dale, of course, is well known to you, the president of the American Chesterton Society, the publisher of Gilbert Magazine, the producer and host of the TV series G.K. Chesterton, the Apostle of Common Sense. Incidentally, the New York Times hailed this program as the channel's crown jewel. And it said, this program, GK, was a sure way to attract young listeners. We also know him as the author and editor of numerous Chesterton books. Dale has lectured at universities around the world, delighting his audiences with his clarity and insights. Here at St. John Fisher College, it has been our good fortune that Dale has consented to be with us at all of our yearly conferences. We've come to think of him affectionately as our own crown jewel. And here he is.
Father, I have to take this. Father Hetzler gave me a very nice introduction, and I'm really grateful for that, but I have to take care of one item of business before I let Father Hetzler sit down. Even though you listed all those accomplishments of mine, you must know that one of the most accomplished Chestertonians in the world is standing here right next to me, and that's Father Hetzler. Yeah. Because he was one of the very first people ever to write a doctoral dissertation on Chesterton, and that was before most of us were alive.
That's right.
And
Before the Civil War.
it was before the Civil War. He wrote it before Chesterton was born. I mean, that was amazing. And has really been an important Chesterton scholar and someone who other Chesterton scholars have turned to as a result of his early work writing about Chesterton. And there was no Chesterton scholarship for many, many years. The Dark Ages lasted a long time. But there was always this one light in the Dark Ages, and that was Father Hetzler. And that's why I want to do one important thing before you sit down. I want to present you with the 2007 American Chesterton Society Lifetime Achievement Award.
Wow.
Right here.
That's great. That's really great. Listen to that.
There you go. Look at that.
Look at that. You know, he even looks a bit like me. Well, my dad makes my tea.
And Father, you can hang that on your Christmas tree if you want. Yeah. The rest of you, though, you can hang this one. I still have a few left. So don't forget the 300-pound Christmas tree. What's that? How to reach it? Wheel? No. What does that mean? Doctor's talking with it?
All right, well, I was really pleased when Lou called me and asked me to speak on Chesterton and conservation. I think that's what it was. Well, it was conservation, right? Because it's a topic I haven't ever talked about, and you know, listening to the thing on St. Paul, that was perfect, because I know he talked about all creation groaning together, and Augustine liked hippos. Then Newman with his Appalachia thing. I know there was I think this is going to fit right in. So this is your chance for your afternoon nap, and then we'll have a nice evening after that. So Chesterton says that. Well, first of all, I have to ask a question. How many here are converts? Look at that. Isn't that something? Wow. Wow. All right, and then how many cradle Catholics? All right. How many non-Catholics? Don't be shy. How many non-Catholics? Okay, sit tight. It's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Chesterton says there's 3 stages to conversion. The first stage is you decide you're going to be fair to the Catholic Church. But he says the problem is there is no way to be fair to the Catholic Church. You're either for it or you're against it. No one is neutral about the Catholic Church. And as soon as they stop being against it, they start feeling themselves being in favor of it and being drawn towards it. That's the first stage. The second stage is discovering the Catholic Church, learning all these things that you never knew. It's like, he says, being in a foreign country where there's all these exotic flowers and animals that you didn't know existed, and you're learning about them for the first time and seeing them for the first time, and you're just taking it all in because it's so new, and you're filling such a void of knowledge that you didn't have before. And there's no commitment. You can turn around and leave anytime you want. Then comes the third stage, running away from the Catholic Church, doing everything you can not to become Catholic. Your head has been convinced at that point. Your heart still has to do something. And this conference, the theme of it is conversion of the heart. It's what happens after that third stage that decides whether or not you make the step forward or run completely away. And some of the great converts of history have had a long stage, a long time in that third stage. And one of those people was G.K. Chesterton. Even though he really was almost completely Catholic in his thinking for well over a decade before his conversion, he did not become Catholic for a long time. You could even argue that Chesterton was thinking essentially like a Catholic in the early 1900s. In 1901, 1902, he was making remarkable comments about the Catholic Church. He says, the church will always be attacked because it's Catholic and always be defended because it's Catholic. He said that in 1901. I mean, really, the second year he was really being published as a major writer in the newspaper. And he had the remarkable comment in his book on the English mystic William Blake, and discussing whether or not Blake was a Christian. And he said, if every man lived 1,000 years, would become one of two things. He'd either become a nihilistic atheist or a member of the Catholic Creed. Those were the only two choices in G.K. Chesterton's mind. And this was 10 years before Chesterton became a Catholic. He said those were the only two directions. You're going to go either completely away from God to the total denial of God, or you're going to come into an embracing of the Catholic Creed. And he was saying this about William Blake, saying that really William Blake was going in the right direction. Remember, he said it's if every man lives 1,000 years. In other words, the only reason Blake never became a Catholic was because he didn't live long enough. which is why C.S. Lewis didn't become a Catholic. He was definitely on the right road. And that's what I think Chesterton would argue about that. And so those were the two choices in Chesterton's mind early on. Great defender of the faith. He even admitted at one point, I'm standing at the door of the church, ushering other people into it without having entered it myself. One of those people, in a wonderful irony, was Ronald Knox, who was a great Anglican chaplain at Oxford University, and who was so affected by reading G.K. Chesterton's book Orthodoxy that it put him on the road to Rome and to conversion. And the irony is that many years later, when Chesterton was really ready to make his move and enter the church, one of the people he contacted was Monsignor Ronald Knox, who is now a Catholic priest. And there's something kind of interestingly twisted about that it was Chesterton that helped get Ronald Knox into the church, and many years later it was Ronald Knox helping Chesterton get into the church. But the question is often asked, why did it take Chesterton so long to become Catholic? When he was thinking like a Catholic, defending the Catholic Church, what took him so long? And the answer is usually given that it had something to do with his wife, Frances. Not that she was standing in the way, but because she had really thought that he was going to convert earlier. Chesterton had a complete physical breakdown in 1914, where he collapsed and was semi-comatose for about 3 months. It's actually a little bit longer than 3 months, and he snapped out of it on Easter Sunday, rose from the dead. And his wife and several other people close to him assumed that as soon as he recovered, he would become Catholic at that point. But he didn't. In fact, he actually made no movement whatsoever to becoming Catholic at that point. But she was, in a sense, already resigned to it, but was making no movement herself towards the Catholic Church. And that's where the problem was for G.K. Chesterton. Because the idea of doing anything without his wife was unthinkable to him. They really had a beautiful, beautiful marriage, and they were at one. Chesterton has this great line about every fairy tale ends with the prince and the princess live happily ever after. He says it doesn't say they live peacefully ever after. They probably threw the furniture at each other, but they were happy, and G.K. and his wife were happy. She utterly took care of him, since he was always so deep in thought, trying to crank out the next article that had to be in before a deadline, and he had many different deadlines to meet, and then writing books and poetry and other stuff besides his required writing that was his source of income. Just trying to get the next thing onto paper was, it just required really, really complete attention. And so that he couldn't take care of little details like remembering to put his shoes on in the morning. He had to have his wife remind him to do that. And if she wasn't around, which happened once in a while because she had other things that took her away once in a while, he turned up at an evening lecture wearing his bedroom slippers. And we all know the famous story that we always repeat, that he gets off the train one day and in the day before cell phones and instant pagers, and goes to the telegraph office and sends a telegram to his wife, "M at Market Harborough, where ought I to be?" And he once went on a lecture tour, and came back and told his wife, "You didn't pack my pajamas." She goes, "Well, why didn't you go buy some pajamas?" He said, You mean you can buy pajamas? And so she in every way made it possible for G.K. Chesterton to be G.K. Chesterton. He was able to accomplish all of his great writing tasks because he had an utterly devoted and supportive wife. And so for him to do anything without her was a problem, but to do the main thing, the most important thing in his life, to suddenly not share his church with his spouse, was something that definitely held him back. And it wasn't until his trip to Jerusalem, and he was coming back from Jerusalem, and he stopped in the port of Brindisi in Italy and was looking at a statue of the Madonna and Child, that he made his decision that when he got back to England, he had to become Catholic. And Monsignor Knox was one of the people he went to for help. But Monsignor Knox himself sensed that Francis Chesterton really didn't trust him, didn't trust Monsignor Knox, and was very happy when Chesterton made the decision to go to a different priest for spiritual direction. And that priest was none other than Father John O'Connor, who was the inspiration for Father Brown. And a lot of people don't know it, that Chesterton wrote half of his Father Brown stories before he became a Catholic. He had met Father O'Connor in about 1908, 09, at a dinner party. And they went out for a walk together, and Father O'Connor expressed his admiration for Chesterton's writing, and they got into a discussion, and Chesterton actually ended up asking some advice on an article that he was working on. Chesterton was someone who always gave the poor and the common man the benefit of the doubt in all things. But Father O'Connor told him that even the poor, even the common man, is capable of great evil. And he told him an incident that just shocked G.K. Chesterton, and he was still shaking from hearing this story. When he got back to the main dinner party, and there were two Cambridge undergraduates talking, and they started talking with Father O'Connor, and they had a nice little discussion about art and music and philosophy, and then Father O'Connor said goodnight and left, and the two Cambridge undergrads said, well, you know, that's an interesting sort of life, and he seems to be an intelligent enough man and cultured and well-spoken, but I couldn't go in for that kind of life because a person like that, meaning a Catholic priest, has no knowledge of the real world. And Chesterton said he wanted to just laugh in their faces because he realized that these two Cambridge undergrads were the ones who knew nothing about the real world and nothing about real evil. He said they knew about as much about real evil as two babies in the same perambulator. Whereas someone who sits and listens to confessions might know a thing or two about evil. And that inspired him to create this fictional detective who everyone dismisses as being naive and innocent and not very smart, in fact, not even noticeable, who can understand the human soul in a very profound and pointed way and thereby solve crimes. In fact, Father Brown, in one of the stories, when asked how he solved all those murders, he said, well, it was easy. I committed them myself. What? Well, it's because he was able to get inside the murderer's mind and think like a sinner. Think like a sinner. He used a moral detection. And so this priest, Father O'Connor, the inspiration for Father Brown, was thereafter always present at particular times in G.K. Chesterton's life when Chesterton needed him the most. And he was a person that Frances also always depended on. And whenever there was a crisis in their home, Frances herself would call on Father O'Connor to come. And it's interesting because while Father O'Connor was definitely a very intelligent man, G.K. Chesterton was in every way his intellectual superior, and really his spiritual superior in the depth of his spiritual insight. And yet, G.K. Chesterton needed a faithful Catholic priest all along his life. It's several points to help get him into the Catholic Church. And the day he was received in 1922 was a profound day in his life because he was very happy. His the parish priest of the little church in Beaconsfield, which at the time was meeting in a temporary building. Chesterton's reception was not in a grand cathedral. It was in a building with a corrugated tin roof, a temporary building built next to the railway hotel in Beaconsfield before the permanent church was built. And he was given a copy of the Penny Catechism to read. In the morning of his reception, he was sitting busily learning about the Catholic Church. And he said that he ran across a passage in the Penny Catechism that the two sins against hope are presumption and despair. And he said when he read that line, that summed up everything that he'd been trying to do in his life, was right against those two sins, against the sins of presumption and despair, because those are certainly the two great modern sins, the sins of the optimist and the pessimist. The optimist, as Chesterton, thinks everything is good except the pessimist, and the pessimist thinks everything is bad except himself. And he said all modern philosophy is either this optimistic denial of sin and denial of evil, which is presumption, or it's this despairing giving up that the world is evil, it's so evil, it's hopeless, and let's just all kill ourselves. And most modern philosophies, Chesterton's always pointing out, lead to first madness and then self-destruction. And he said here was this simple line that summed it all up for him, that the Catholic Church had the greatest view of reality, leaning neither towards presumption or towards despair. And it was a bittersweet day because he was very happy, and so was Frances. She was happy for him. And yet they both cried. He wrote a poem called The Convert that ends with these lines. The sages have 100 maps to give, to trace their crawling cosmos like a tree. They rattle out reason through many a sieve that stores the dust and lets the gold go free. But all these things are less than dust to me, because my name is Lazarus, and I live. The reason they both cried is because they knew that they weren't sharing something anymore. The story ends happily. Frances became Catholic 4 years later. But in the interim, there was a difficult time for them. There's no question that when they didn't share that basic thing in their life, it filled G.K. Chesterton with a kind of longing that he never had before. And it was at that time when he wrote his book on St. Francis of Assisi, who was the namesake of his wife. And that is a book that is unlike any other book that Chesterton wrote. It doesn't have all the amusing paradoxes in it and all the great one-liners. It's a book that's about a love affair with God. Now, you've heard it said, and I've heard it said, that converts make the best Catholics. I am proof that that is not true. It depends on what you mean by best, but anyway, any possible use of the word, I still prove it wrong. Now, there is this one advantage that converts have over the cradle Catholic, and that is that we've seen the church from the outside and from the inside. We know what the outside is like, unlike any insider will ever know, and we know what the outside is like. You know what I'm saying. And that is something that no Catholic, a cradle Catholic really doesn't understand that. And there are Catholics, of course, born in the church and then who leave the church. I would argue in some way that they never really got a good look at the inside before they left. They left the church in a bad mood. And it's easy to leave the Catholic Church. It's much harder to get in. As we've, I think, indicated in the other talks this morning, you can't become Catholic at a Billy Graham crusade. It's not just a momentary decision. It requires a decision followed by a lot of hard work and a lot of actually banging on the door before the church even lets you in, because they want people who are serious about their faith to be Catholics. And what the convert goes through is not unlike what a priest goes through in discerning his vocation. In fact, it's not unlike what the church goes through when determining sainthood for a candidate for canonization. They have to answer all the questions. The convert wants all the questions answered. And that gives them a little bit of an advantage because they know what they're getting into when they enter the church. They don't enter with their eyes closed. But while we may have the advantage of going through that before getting into the church, the cradle Catholic has a different advantage of never having to quite go through the pain of conversion. But the cradle Catholic has a different experience that he has to go through. And we've talked about St. Paul this morning. And interesting enough, Chesterton himself says that Catholics think first of St. Peter and Protestants think first of St. Paul. And ironically, that's correct. But if Protestants thought enough about St. Paul, they would become Catholic. Because St. Paul is the great convert. And at one point, the scales finally fell from his eyes. And that's what happens to any honest Protestant who keeps asking sincere questions about the truth. The church never runs and hides from those questions. But what the cradle Catholic has to go through is what St. Peter himself went through. You'll recall in John chapter 6, where Jesus says, "I am the bread that has come down from heaven. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in you. For my flesh is real food and my blood is real drink." And you'll recall the reaction that everyone had when they heard that. They all said, "Well, this is great. Where do I sign up?" Right? Some of these Catholics have read their Bible, Father. So it's not true that the Catholics don't read their Bible. But then you'll remember what happened after that. After certain people objected to that sort of imagery, what did Jesus do? He ran after them and said, "Let me explain what I really meant," right? That I was using just an image. It was a metaphor. It was a metaphor. No. But then you recall that several of his disciples said, this is great, right? This is our guy, and we're going to stand with him, right? That's what they said? And I knew what he was talking about. I knew what he was talking about. I knew what he meant, right? This is a hard saying. Who could accept it? And Jesus turned and said, do you want to leave too? And that's what Jesus asks to every cradle Catholic. Every cradle Catholic has to go through that moment where Jesus looks at you and says, do you want to leave too? And hopefully you'll answer the way St. Peter answered. Now, G.K. Chesterton did not go through, even though those three stages of conversion that he describes are three stages that almost every convert will heartily agree with. It was exactly the right description. He did not go through a kind of conversion that many Protestants go through because he did not have the same sorts of problems with many Catholic doctrines that many Protestants do have problems with. For instance, one of my biggest problems was, I was a Baptist, by the way, and Baptists don't really have a high view of Mary and the saints, to put it mildly. There's two good stories to tell about that. I suppose I should back up and say that I started reading G.K. Chesterton like anybody else on my honeymoon. And like any good Baptist, I was honeymooning in Rome. And I was reading The Everlasting Man. It's my honeymoon, right? And my wife was reading Les Miserables. And we happened to be in Rome on the day the Pope was shot in May of 1981. And since I was a Baptist, I was one of the suspects, naturally. The interrogation went pretty well. It was not as bad as the interrogation I got when I went to Canada last year to give a talk. And we were walking back to the hotel that night because we'd been in the Church of St. Peter and James. And we were looking at the statue of the Moses by Michelangelo when we got the word. And there was just this shock and panic, of course. And they were supposed to take us back to our hotel as part of the tour, but our hotel was right next to the Vatican, so we had to walk back, and there was this mass chaos in the streets, and sirens and everything, and then suddenly everybody went inside. The whole city went inside because they all wanted to get updates on the mission of the Pope. And we had the city of Rome to ourselves. And it was an unforgettable and unrepeatable experience. I walked across the Tiber that night. I really had the experience not unlike what Chesterton describes in his book, Man Alive, where Innocent Smith walks out of his back door and walks all the way around the world to walk into his front door. My trip to Rome began in Rome, and I had to walk all the way around the world to get to Rome and find my way home. It took me a long time. One of my problems, actually my first and my last hurdle, was with the Catholic attitude towards the Virgin Mary. For Chesterton, he always had a devotion to Mary. Long before he was even thinking like a Christian, he was attracted to this figure. And certainly before he became a Catholic, he was writing poetry about Mary. And it's in his poetry where you find the most references to the Virgin Mary. His prose, surprisingly, there's very few references. There's a couple essays in The Well of the Shallows, the book that Joseph referred to earlier.
But the most of the references you're going to find are in his poetry. And one of the greatest of all is in the Ballad of the White Horse. And that's Our Lady of Edmund, which is that painting that you're going to buy references for. And then there's this wonderful poem where it ends with the lines, "So in our house, lust without life shall die, and in your house, Mary, life without lust shall live." And he very, very prophetically sees this, how the sexual revolution would be this attack on life itself. It would end up being this attack on life itself because of this, what Chesterton calls the exaltation of lust while we're forbidding fertility. And Mary, of course, represents just the opposite of that. And the whole image of the virgin birth, which is the most, it's the first aspect you think of at Christmas. Christmas begins with the virgin birth. And those two concepts, virgin and birth, are utterly put down and neglected and laughed upon in our modern world. And he just, as Chesterton is the master of paradox, someone who loved paradox, said he could never get to the bottom of that unfathomable paradox in the phrase, the mother of God. What a greater paradox is there than that phrase, the mother of God. Me, on the other hand, I had a lot of problems with Mary. Because I knew that it was just some leftover pagan goddess worship, and that the Catholics were just kissing these idols, and it was so disgusting. And but like any good Baptist who never had any intention of becoming Catholic, I once went on a retreat to a monastery. And the priest, the priest did not eat with the rest of the monks because this priest actually did not belong to that order. So we're sitting eating by ourselves, and he realizes that I'm not Catholic. He says, "You're not Catholic." I said, No. "So why haven't you converted?" And no one had ever asked me that before. And of course, it was obviously the person that God had put in my path right at that moment. But I mean, he had a pretty good basis to ask the question because we were, after all, sitting there in a monastery. And he knew I was there for something. And so he just put the question to me. And for the first time in my life, I had to defend why I was not a Catholic. And it was a bad moment for me because at that point I was starting to agree. I'd been fair to the Catholic Church, and I was starting to understand a lot about it, but I was still having this problem with Mary, and I mumbled some sort of objection to Mary, Virgin Mary, Mary. And he looks at me and he says, "Do you believe that her soul magnifies the Lord?" Quote scripture to a Baptist. Got me right in my weak point there. So I get this blow to my kneecap right away, and I realize for the first time I realize what that means. My soul makes God bigger. Think about that for a paradox. My soul makes God bigger. It didn't take much more investigation to realize that every major saint throughout history has had a great mystical devotion to Mary, that devotion to Mary makes God bigger. And what first got me on the road to becoming Catholic, of course, was reading G.K. Chesterton. It would happen so subtle, I didn't even realize it was happening. But Chesterton makes you think about things that you aren't ready to think about. And he does it in this loving, witty, and profound way. And at a certain point, I was hanging out with these other Chesterton devotees. There were, 6 of us. And
there was some talk that they'd heard some talk about some interest in getting Chesterton canonized. And they started going, oh, that would be so bad if Chesterton were canonized. It would just turn off all the Protestants who like him because he appeals so much to evangelicals and other Protestants. And if he were canonized, that would just blow the whole thing. That would make him too Catholic. And I'm saying, are you kidding? That would be great if Chesterton were canonized. I mean, our idea of saints is that they're all these 12-year-old barefoot girls, you know? You need more 300-pound cigar-smoking saints. And I said, if you canonize Chesterton, I'll become a Catholic. But the church didn't take the bait. I mean, I throw this softball out there, nothing happens. They all just sat on their hands. And so I had to go and become Catholic through the normal channels, which is really, really inconvenient, let me tell you. And to finish the irony of that story, a few years ago I was going to travel to England, and I sent a letter to the Bishop of Northampton asking for just a brief audience so that I could learn what the status of Chesterton's canonization was, because I get a lot of questions about it. And he wrote me just a very quick letter saying, yes, I'll meet with you at such and such a time. And I find out later, before I get there, but after I've gotten his letter, that absolutely nothing has been done on Chesterton's canonization. Nothing, nada. And that my meeting was actually what's called first contact. So I was the one who said, canonize Chesterton, I'll become Catholic. I become Catholic, and there I am telling the bishop why they've got to canonize Chesterton. Keep praying for his canonization, because it's going to have to depend on a lot more than me pushing for it. But I'll tell you, I get emails and letters from all over the world from people who believe that Chesterton should be canonized and want to see him canonized. And it was exactly because of that I, in those early days, had an epiphany. I had an instantaneous understanding of what the communion of saints means, a phrase that was utterly meaningless to me as a Baptist. I understood it completely in 1 second when I heard that there was an interest in canonizing G.K. Chesterton. I knew right away that, well, of course G.K. Chesterton is in the presence of God. And oh yeah, saints don't get between you and Christ. They bring you closer to Christ. And if there's anybody I'd want to be my advocate, is someone who's already shows that he understands me and is already batting for me. Yeah, I understand that. And oh yeah, every saint has a cultus around him. And I knew which cultus I belonged to, and I was unashamed of it. In fact, I gloried in belonging to that cult. And sure, Chesterton's a saint, and there are saints. And what a great idea the Catholic Church had when coming up with the idea of sainthood. So that took another one off the list. Of course, I was a great Bible student as a Baptist, and there's nothing wrong with that. My love for Scripture continues to this day. But I will say that studying the lives of the saints is probably the best way to study Scripture, because the saints are applied Scripture. When you're wondering how this verse applies to my life, just find out what a certain saint said about that piece of Scripture, because they no doubt lived out that piece of Scripture. They are the best models. And of course, the prime model Christian is the Blessed Virgin Mary. And when I started thinking of her as the model Christian, it opened up a whole new world to me. I read something that a monk had written, how We are all supposed to be like Mary, carrying Christ within us and then giving Christ to the world. That's what we're all supposed to do. That's why she's the model Christian. She shows us how to carry Christ and then how to give Christ to the world. I said that there was this thing with Francis that held Chesterton's conversion off. But there was one other thing that delayed his conversion. And it comes out in his book, The Catholic Church and Conversion, which Tom has a few copies of that left back there. You can get it. That's a book that you all should read. He says, there is a time in the potential convert's life. This is the way he writes it. He goes, for the convert's sake, it should be remembered that one foolish word from inside does more harm than 100,000 foolish words from outside. Put it another way, there's almost nothing that any enemy of the church can say that will hold back the potential convert. But one wrong word from a Catholic can do a great deal of harm. It can do untold harm. And that comes from two different directions, too. There's certainly the foolish word that comes from the type of Catholic who just simply doesn't know their faith and who's ready to water it down to make it more appealing to the potential convert. And so they'll sacrifice anything just because to make the church look more appealing. Whereas the convert, the potential convert, is already willing to sacrifice everything for those truths. Already they're disposed to believe the church's teachings on the Eucharist and on marriage and on abortion and contraception. They're already disposed to believe those things. And then they hear those things softened or neglected or even denied by Catholics. That does great harm. But it should also be remembered that the other side can do great harm too. They can be way too hard on the Protestants. They can be too dismissive. Because the sincere Protestant really does love Christ and wants to know Christ better. And that's why they're coming closer to the Catholic Church. And by openly belittling Protestant faith, that does absolutely no help for the Catholic Church. So we have to avoid the two opposite problems of a bull-headed condemnation of everything that is not Catholic and a soft-headed tolerance of everything that is not Catholic. Or what Chesterton calls the truth that is pitiless and the pity that is untruthful. Speaking the truth in love. And no one did it better than G.K. Chesterton. When he debated with his opponents, he would always start by agreeing with them. He'd always find some truth that they had in common. There's only one person that he ever refused to debate with, and that was a Satanist. Because he said, there's no starting point. There's no starting point. But anyone else, even some little bare shred of truth that Chesterton could grasp in his opponent's argument, that's what he would seize on and start by saying, I agree with you. And that would utterly disarm the opponent because it shows that he's interested in the truth. And then, he'll take the truth that they have in common and then he'll say, this is where you go off in the wrong direction and here's where the fullness of the truth leads. And that's how he did it. And it's magnificent to watch. And it was magnificent for me. I never thought that I would become Catholic. When Chester was asked why he became Catholic, his quick answer was to get rid of my sins. Only the Catholic Church does that. When a man walks out of the confessional, he's 5 minutes old. You get to start your whole life over again. No other church offers that. And then, of course, he says the Catholic Church is the only thing that saves a man from the degrading slavery of being a child of his age. Chester's always fighting against the fashions and the fads and the ideas that are fleeting and defending the ideas that are permanent. And he says a Catholic is someone who's bucked up the courage to say that there's something else that is smarter than he is. We can trust the church. And when we start thinking that we're smarter than the church, look out. The hardest thing for the non-Catholic to realize is probably also one of the hardest things for the Catholic to realize. Chesterton says it's this, that the church is not only right, but it's always right. That's astonishing. The final thought from G.K. Chesterton is for our theme of conversion here. He says, the age is always converted by the saint that contradicts it most. I think we all have seen that in our lifetime with Mother Teresa as a saint that contradicts the age. But I will also offer G.K. Chesterton as a saint who contradicts the age. He contradicts all the philosophy that is taught. He certainly contradicts the age's ideas about health. The worship of health, he says, can be unhealthy. He contradicts it when it comes to cigars. If Chesterton were canonized, we could bring back smoking in bars again. I know we could do it. He contradicts the age's ideas on money and on business, on politics, on pleasure, and certainly on the issue of life. He was the great defender of life, and he saw the culture of death coming. He's the saint that can convert this age. God bless.